In 2019, a marine biologist named Thessaly Cormorant descended to an underwater cave system 40 miles off the Florida Keys, and what she found in the darkness was impossible. A colony of humanoid figures, scaled and finned, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate settlement pattern. Skeletal structures combined human anatomy with adaptations no evolutionary process could explain. Official science was clear on one thing: mermaids did not exist, had never existed, and every supposed sighting in history had been debunked as manatees, folklore, or deliberate hoaxes. The scientific community agreed these creatures were myth, but there they were, 180 feet down in a cave system that appeared on no oceanographic charts, waiting in the Florida deep. What Thessaly discovered in that colony would cost 4 lives over the next 3 years. When researchers finally extracted tissue samples and ran genetic analysis, the results rewrote everything we thought we knew about marine biology. These were not mythological creatures or evolutionary anomalies. They were human, and what had been done to them was worse than any legend. 15 years studying deep-sea reef ecosystems in the Caribbean had given Thessaly Cormorant advanced degrees in marine biology and underwater archaeology, along with the discovery of 3 new species of deep-sea fish and coral formations that textbooks claimed could not exist at certain depths. When a commercial fishing operation reported unusual sonar readings in a restricted zone off the Keys, the Coast Guard contacted her. The readings showed a massive cave network far larger than any known formation in the area, which meant Thessaly assembled a technical diving team and obtained permits to investigate. In August 2019, they descended to the coordinates and found the cave entrance appearing as a dark slash in the limestone shelf. The water temperature dropped 15 degrees as they entered, and their lights cut through absolute blackness, illuminating walls that showed evidence of tool marks, human tool marks. Deliberate excavation. Someone had carved this space, and that is when Thessaly's light found the first one. A skeletal figure wedged in a crevice, approximately 5 feet long, with a skull that was elongated and a jaw that hinged differently than human anatomy. But the eye sockets were positioned frontally for binocular vision. The hands had elongated fingers with webbing that had calcified between the bones, and the rib cage showed expansion modifications with the sternum jutting forward, suggesting increased lung capacity. The lower body terminated in what appeared to be a fused leg structure where the bones had melded together and flattened into a broad, fan-shaped appendage. Scales adhered to portions of the remaining tissue, iridescent even in decay. Thessaly surfaced, confused, and contacted the Smithsonian, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and the University of Miami. Every expert she reached responded with polite skepticism, because what she was describing was anatomically impossible. Human skeletons do not develop scales. But Thessaly had photographed everything and had documentation, so she returned to the cave. Over the next 6 months, she and her team made 23 dives to the site and discovered the cave system extended over 200 yards into the limestone shelf. The skeletal remains numbered at least 40 individuals, possibly more, buried in the silt, and they were not scattered randomly. They were arranged in clusters that looked like family groups. Some of the smaller skeletons, children, were positioned near larger ones in configurations that suggested protection or care. These things had lived together and died together. The preservation was astonishing because the cave's depth and specific salinity had created conditions that prevented normal decomposition. Soft tissue remained on several specimens, and when Thessaly examined it under magnification, she found cellular structures that made no biological sense. Muscle fibers showed adaptations for extreme pressure resistance, and skin samples revealed layered dermis with oil-producing glands far more developed than human anatomy. These were not evolutionary adaptations because evolution does not work this fast. These modifications were deliberate. And that is when the team found the laboratory section. In the deepest chamber, they discovered equipment that included surgical tools corroded but identifiable, and restraint systems bolted to the cave walls. Documentation cylinders, waterproof containers designed to preserve paper underwater, sat waiting to be opened. When they opened the first cylinder, they found medical records, experiment logs, and subject identification numbers. The documents were dated 1962 to 1967, and the letterhead read Naval Medical Research Unit 7, a division that, according to every official source, had never existed. The records detailed a program called Thalassa Protocol with an objective of human aquatic adaptation and permanent modification of human physiology for extended underwater operations. The subjects were identified only by numbers subject 001 through subject 057, and the procedures described in clinical military language were horrifying. Surgical fusion of lower limbs, chemical treatments to induce scale growth, genetic modification using compounds listed only as experimental embryonic derivatives, lung restructuring, and bone density alteration. The success rate was approximately 70%, which meant the other 30% died during the procedures. Of the survivors, the logs indicated behavioral deterioration began within 6 months as subjects became unresponsive to commands, refused surface protocols, and demonstrated pack behaviors inconsistent with human social patterns. The final entries, dated December 1967, were brief. They stated that subjects were contained in a designated site. The protocol was terminated. The facility was sealed. All records were classified. Thessaly understood what she was reading. This was human experimentation conducted by the military, where someone had taken people and tried to turn them into mermaids. And when the experiment failed and the subjects could not be controlled, they had been sealed in this cave and left to die. If the documents were authentic, the U.S. military had conducted biological experiments on human subjects during the 1960s that violated every ethical standard, had created hybrid organisms that could not survive without specific environmental conditions, and when the program was deemed unsuccessful, had disposed of the evidence by entombing the subjects alive. Thessaly contacted federal authorities, and the response was immediate and absolute. The dive site was declared a restricted military zone with access prohibited, and the documentation she had recovered was classified under national security protocols. Thessaly was instructed that discussing her findings publicly would result in criminal prosecution. She was told the remains were being properly handled, and she was ordered to stop diving. Thessaly stopped reporting to authorities. She did not stop diving. The mystery consumed her in ways that would prove dangerous. Every night she reviewed the photographs, and every day she researched naval medical programs from the 1960s. Finding nothing because the program had been erased from official history as thoroughly as the subjects had been erased from the world. But the bodies were real 47 skeletons in that cave, arranged in family groupings and showing evidence of deliberate modification. Someone had done this, had authorized it, had funded it, and had executed it. The obsession that would cost 4 lives had begun, and Thessaly recruited a documentary filmmaker named Corvus Milhauser to help expose the discovery. Corvus was known for investigative work on government cover-ups and believed Thessaly immediately, which meant they made 6 more dives together, filming everything, collecting tissue samples and documenting the remains before they could be disappeared. In March 2021, while making their 7th dive, Corvus experienced fatal equipment failure at depth when his rebreather malfunctioned, and carbon dioxide poisoning induced unconsciousness before he could reach the surface. Thessaly tried to save him but could not. The cave that had killed 47 people in 1967 claimed its 48th victim. The diving community wanted Thessaly to stop because the risk was not justified and these people were already dead. Leave the dead in peace. But Thessaly refused because, if anything, Corvus's death made the work more urgent since he had died trying to expose the truth. 2 months later, a tissue sample Thessaly had submitted to a private genetics lab came back with results that changed everything. The DNA showed human markers, definitively human, but it also showed modifications and inserted genetic sequences that did not occur naturally in human biology. The lab identified material from multiple marine species, including dolphin, shark, and deep-sea fish species that could survive extreme pressure and low oxygen. Someone had not just modified these people surgically, but had altered them at the genetic level, splicing aquatic DNA into human chromosomes. The technology to do this did not officially exist in 1967, but the evidence proved otherwise and showed someone had developed gene splicing technology years before the official timeline and had tested it on human subjects. The ethical violations were unconscionable because these were not volunteers. The age range included children as young as 6 years old, and no child can consent to experimental surgery. The subjects were prisoners, as evidenced by the surgical restraints, the isolation, and the military documentation. These were prisoners converted into test subjects without consent and without hope of release. And when the experiments produced results that could not be controlled, they were sealed in the cave. The cave was not a tomb, but an execution chamber where the subjects had been alive when it was sealed. The evidence was written in the claw marks near the entrance and the skeletal hands frozen in positions of desperate climbing. Some had tried to escape, but the water in the cave was too deep to surface from without decompression, and the entrance was blocked. The subjects were trapped, and some would have died quickly from stress while others would have survived longer. Swimming in the darkness and breathing stagnant air in the upper portions until it became unbreathable. How long had it taken? Days or weeks? The bones could not speak. Thessaly began contacting family advocacy groups and organizations that helped relatives of victims of government experimentation. Because perhaps somewhere, families were still searching for people who disappeared in the 1960s. The response was stronger than anticipated as dozens of families came forward with relatives who disappeared during the 1960s after being incarcerated in federal facilities. Many were political activists, some were criminals, and others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The families had searched for decades and filed missing persons reports that went nowhere as their loved ones had simply vanished into the system and never emerged. When Thessaly provided the dates and facility designation, several families recognized the information because their relatives had been held at a facility in the Keys during that exact time period, a facility officially listed as minimum security but with medical wings that were off limits. The families wanted closure and wanted to know if their relatives were among the bodies, which meant Thessaly arranged for DNA samples to be compared. It took 8 months, but 3 families received confirmation. Subject 019 was Aldrich Torrance, 23 when he disappeared after being arrested during a civil rights demonstration in 1963, transferred to an unnamed facility, and never seen again. Subject 033 was Lysandra Kemp, 19, incarcerated for drug possession and listed as transferred with no further documentation. Subject 041 was Brennix Galloway, 16, a runaway picked up by federal agents with no record of charges or release. All 3 families had spent nearly 60 years searching, and now they had answers. Their relatives had been turned into experiments, modified and transformed, then sealed in a cave and left to die. In November 2022, two researchers from a genetics ethics organization descended to the cave to collect additional samples for a legal case, and both were experienced technical divers. Something went wrong at depth when they violated decompression protocols, and both surfaced with the bends. One died in the recompression chamber, while the other survived but suffered permanent neurological damage. The cave had claimed 2 more lives, and Thalassa was devastated. Some argued she should stop because the deaths were mounting, but the families disagreed and told Thalassa to continue. For 60 years they had wondered, and now they knew. Even if the truth was horrible, they wanted it known. The government's response was predictable with official denials. The cave site remained restricted, the documents were declared forgeries, and the genetic evidence was dismissed as contaminated. Naval Medical Research Unit 7 had never existed. Thalassa Protocol was fiction, and the bodies were unrelated to any military program. Perhaps they were victims of a serial killer, or perhaps they were refugees who died in a maritime accident, or perhaps they were anything except what the evidence clearly indicated. The families filed lawsuits, but the cases were dismissed on national security grounds and the evidence was classified. The legal system provided no avenue for accountability, but Thalassa continued documenting and made dive after dive, recording every detail before the site could be destroyed. In the skeletal remains, Thalassa found something else. Not all had drowned or suffocated, as some showed signs of violence, with trauma to the skulls and broken bones. These people had fought each other, and in the final days or weeks of confinement, as the air grew foul and hope disappeared, the subjects had turned on each other. The modifications had changed more than their bodies because the behavioral deterioration mentioned in the logs was real. These people had stopped being human in ways that went beyond the physical and had become something else. Something that could not coexist peacefully. The horror was layered since they had been modified against their will, sealed in a cave to die, and in their final moments, they had torn each other apart. The cave held not just the evidence of government atrocity, but the evidence of what that atrocity had created. Monsters made from people who had committed no crime except being vulnerable. The ethical questions remain unresolved. Should Thalassa have left the cave undisturbed? 4 people died pursuing this truth, including Corvus, 2 researchers, and a geneticist found dead in his lab under circumstances ruled suicide, but that Thalassa will never believe were anything except murder. Was the truth worth those lives? The families say yes, while the diving community says no. There is no resolution because the dead cannot speak for themselves. The cave remains restricted, and the government has announced plans to seal it permanently, which means once that happens, any remaining evidence will be entombed forever. Thalassa has been prohibited from diving the site and threatened with prosecution. The bodies remain 180 feet down, 47 people, with most younger than 30 when they died. Some were teenagers who had never committed crimes but were pulled from streets or taken from prisons and converted into experiments that killed them. They were erased from records, transformed in secret facilities, and sealed in darkness when the program failed. They died not as humans but as something else, something military science had created and then discarded, and Thalassa paid for the discovery with obsession. With years of her life, with nightmares that do not fade, and with the knowledge that her pursuit cost 4 people their lives. The families who learned what happened received answers they had stopped expecting. But the historical record will not be corrected. The government denies everything. The cave will be sealed and the mystery is solved, but the truth will remain classified. The subjects are identified, but their names will not be memorialized. The ocean kept this secret for 50 years and surrendered the truth only when someone was willing to die for it. And when that truth emerged, the same government that created the horror worked to bury it again. The water is dark at 180 feet where the cave is collapsing slowly under the weight of decades and the bones are arranged where death left them, still showing the modifications that destroyed their humanity waiting for visitors who will never come again. Some truths are too terrible to acknowledge, some crimes are too vast to prosecute, and some graves are meant to stay hidden. The mermaids of Florida were real, and what was done to them was more horrifying than any legend.